I mean, you give the game away where you say in your book, Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in the natural way. Now that betrays you as it were pretending you think they really existed, because you wouldn't have said they were born in a natural way unless you were muddling up facts with symbols there, because you don't think that Cain and Abel existed.
Well, I don't. What do I think about Cain and Abel? I said, I think the pattern that they represent always exists. Always exists.
You understand that that's a different thing.
What's a different matter? A pattern that they represent, the conflict between brothers, the rivalry between brothers. This is a fundamental pattern, which yes, it's something that's there. But I care about facts. I mean, did they exist or did they not exist?
I actually agree with Dawkins here. Either it happened or it didn't, and if it didn't, it's just a nice sentiment or something like a poem, but it doesn't really matter. The church teaches and has always taught the fundamental sense of Scripture is the literal. Either it happened or it didn't. If the resurrection narrative is just a nice story, I don't want to be Christian anymore. I'm not willing to give my life for something that didn't actually happen. So I actually agree with Dawkins here, and I like the fact that he's pushing Peterson. Yes, there's psychological truths that can be drawn out of the Genesis narrative, of course, but did it actually happen? And I'm hoping Peterson says yes.
Well, I can imagine a situation where when the story was originated, that it referred to two actual brothers, but as the stories propagate across time, as they mutate, as they adapt, let's say, to the structure of human memory, they deepen and they become broader. And so then they become emblematic not only of the pattern of conflict that might characterize the original two brothers that the story was about, but about the conflict between brothers as such, and then the more fundamental levels of conflict that exist within human beings, which is what you see in more sophisticated literature. It's like the biblical accounts speak of fact in a factual manner upon occasion, but the biblical accounts also speak poetically and metaphorically and allegorically, and people who are sophisticated in biblical analysis have known this for centuries.
But did it happen or not? He keeps dodging that question. So I think it's important to keep in mind that what the church teaches about Revelation is that God inspires the actions themselves, and he inspires the words that describe the actions. And part of the obligation on God's part, if he wants to reveal something to us, he's obligated to keep that revelation intact throughout history so that we have access to it. And that's the role that the church plays today as the guardian of the deposit of faith. We have the complete revelation of God preserved in the living tradition of the church. I know Peterson's wife is Catholic, so hopefully she's feeding him some of this information, and hopefully he'll be baptized soon.
You think the author of that story in Genesis was a literary genius?
Just say yes.
I think that there's a spirit of literary genius at work across millennia, crafting that story so that it has almost an infinite depth.
Okay, so I think that this actually gives me a lot of clarity in what Peterson actually thinks. He thinks that there is an author of true events that actually happened, and then throughout the course of time, different authors take the text and corrupt it slightly or add their own insights. And then what we have today as the book of Genesis is a sort of compilation of millennia of thought, millennia of different people contributing to this one narrative, so that you end up with the book of Genesis and you end up with this infinite psychological depth that he's talking about. Okay, well, the church holds and always has held that Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. And I wish Peterson would just say yes and give a straightforward answer. But I think that regardless of what you think about Genesis, it all comes down to, what do you think about the Gospels? Did the resurrection happen or not? Because the Gospels are the most well-attested documents of the first few centuries. If any documents are authentic and authentically written by the people who purport to write them, it is the Gospels. So were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John lying or not? If they were lying, I don't want to be Christian. If Jesus did not raise from the dead, I don't want to be Christian anymore. It's a waste of time. But if he did, then we should believe everything that he taught, including the authenticity of the book of Genesis. So it all comes down to the resurrection. Was the tomb empty Sunday morning or not? If yes, you should be Christian. If no, you should be something else.
How that relates to the original author or sequential authors, I don't know, because it's lost in the seeds of time. It's lost in history.
So the story evolved. You're saying
It's an interesting interview.
I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, because maybe that's true and perhaps it's not. So the first question is, do you think that there are any marked differences between cultural traditions that would enable you to rank order them in terms of their ethical validity?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so for example, we could contrast mainstream UK Christianity with Islamic fundamentalism.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy.
There is a hierarchy.
Okay, a hierarchy that points to what?
Well, in the case of Islam, I dislike any religion which punishes apostasy with death, that throws gay people off high buildings.
Okay, so Peterson actually is doing a great job here, because you got Dawkins in a pickle. He says that there are some societies, some moral norms that are better than others. But at the same time, who sets the scale? Who gives a society a grade? If it's just subjective because there is no higher power that can assign meaning to things, then it's just his opinion versus the opinion of Muslims. And it doesn't really matter. It's completely subjective. Peterson's doing a good job here of saying, okay, well, some things are better than others. Why? Why? And if you don't have somebody that can set the scales and attribute a real value and meaning to something, then you're just left where Dawkins is, and I don't think he'll be able to answer this question.
The virgin birth results from a mistranslation of Isaiah. You know that.
These sorts of questions. What would you say? They don't strike me as. They're not getting to the point.
I know
the
that. I know
story has
you
a
think
purpose.
that. Yes.
Well,
That is the point. Either it happened, either the incarnation happened, or it didn't. Either the virgin birth happened, or it didn't. You can't psychologically weasel your way out of that. I don't care how much psychological truth is in the Gospels. I don't care if the incarnation didn't happen. Either God was made man, or he wasn't. That's it. Peterson, stop squirming. Just answer the question.
Look, I understand that there's perfect reasons to debate this. I know that. And I know that your question is more than valid, but it's beside the issue as far as I'm concerned. And it's partly because, well, when we started this conversation, I said, for example, that it appears to be the case that a description of the structure through which we see the world is a story. We see the world through a story. And so that's a remarkable thing. That's a remarkable discovery, and it's emerged probably in the last 60 years in multiple disciplines, because we have to prioritize our facts. And so we prioritize them according to a particular pattern.
He's totally right there. The stories that you believe about the universe and about reality as a whole shape the way that you interpret the data. This is why Aristotle, 3,000 years ago, said that as a man is, so does the end seem to him. A good man, because of what he believes, will believe that good things are good and bad things are bad. And a wicked man will believe the opposite. So he's right. The stories that you tell yourself, the stories that you believe, shape your fundamental interactions with all of reality. He's right. But the question here is not which story, psychological story, should I apply to my life so that I can be as happy as I want and live a fulfilling life with meaning and purpose. That's not the question. The question is this story true or not? If it is true, every single person on earth is obligated to accept Jesus. If it's not true, then Jesus was a liar and a fraud, and the apostles were liars and frauds. And they built a false church and deceived the entire world, and Christianity is no longer something that's just a nice idea, a nice story. It's the biggest scam in human history. We can't have this sort of idea of where, well, there's a lot of truths in this story. There's a lot of value in this story. And at the same time say, I don't know if the story is true or not. Either Jesus is Lord or he's liar. Either Jesus is the King of Kings or he is the greatest con man ever to have lived. You can't sit on the fence on that. You cannot.
Professor Dawkins, would you say that underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption? You can You can make scientific investigations in the world, but in order to do so, you need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified. And so does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption of space?
I suppose it does. I mean, I think that maybe just be Jordan and Richard, by the way. I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary.
So this is what you do. You take all the good ideas in Jordan Peterson and you take all the good ideas in Richard Dawkins and you marry them together and you end up Christian. Dawkins is emphasizing the facts and Peterson is emphasizing the more spiritual reality. So whenever you're interpreting the scriptures and you're looking at the faith, there's certainly a literal aspect, which Dawkins is representing, and there's certainly a spiritual, a moral, a psychological aspect, which Peterson is embodying. If you take those two and you put them together, you just end up Christian. So it's interesting that these guys are having this discussion, and I wish Peterson would just say, yes, the resurrection happened and the virgin birth happened, or no, it didn't. Because then, I don't know, he would just he would be something instead of being in the middle all the time. So that was fascinating. Cool.